The McKay interview is sponsored by the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, preparing leaders for new challenges in international security.
Hello everyone. It's an honour and privilege to have the opportunity to talk to exceptional people in front of the microphone and to be the conduit which brings them in contact with a wider audience, especially the rather special World Radio Switzerland audience. Today, my guest is a former head of state, a former President of the Republic of Ireland, the first woman in that role, I should add, and someone with impeccable Geneva credentials, having been 20 years ago, seems hard to believe, 20 years ago has gone so quickly, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. You've guessed correctly that I'm in the presence of Mary Robinson. President Robinson, it's an honour to meet you. Thanks so much for making time for me today. I would say again, because we met very briefly before once, welcome to the McKay interview.
Thank you, Michael. It's very good to be back in Geneva.
It's really good to see you again. President Robinson, your career in public life has been so rich and full that too many topics presented themselves for me as I tried to choose just a few that we could talk about in the 25 minutes or so of our conversation. So please forgive me if I miss out something of particular importance to you, and better still, tell me what it is and share it with me and our listeners. Now, just to get our conversation going, my first question is an obvious one. You're no stranger to Geneva, but why are you here this time?
I'm here for the second international conference of the Simmons College on Women's Leadership. This is second international, but they're very, very well known in the United States for women's leadership. And I'm delighted they were in Berlin last year, we're in Geneva this year. And it's great to have young women in particular hear other women and get very excited about the potential of women's leadership.
So it's an American university, essentially, which puts on these big events on a regular basis.
Yes, and for good causes, to promote scholarships to Simmons College.
I see. What achievements, Mrs. Robinson, in your long career give you the greatest sense of satisfaction? It's a fairly unsurprising question, but you've done so many interesting things.
Yeah, it's hard for me to talk about achievements. I can certainly say that it was the greatest honour to be elected President of Ireland.
Well, be modest and use that word then, please.
Well, because I had quite a liberal background in the cases that I took in the court and the issues that I raised in the Irish Senate over 20 years, it was a signal my country was opening up, and it was a very special election, I think, for Ireland. And I was very proud and very honoured. And I was very keen, as President, to somehow also signal that Ireland cared about human rights, which was my passion. And I didn't know what it might be possible to do, but I ended up being the first head of state to go to Rwanda after the genocidal killing. And before that, in 1992, I went to Somalia at the height of the food crisis because there were warlords preventing food getting to the feeding stations. And these are the memories that I have of trying to not just represent Ireland, but also do it in a way that furthered human rights.
But there'll be people listening who don't know you, who'll be curious to know more about these cases that you brought to light before you became the head of state.
Yes, I was lucky enough.
Tell us a little bit about that.
I was lucky enough to be able to specialise in constitutional law, and in the end to realise that when Ireland joined the European Union, the directives of the European Union would be very helpful in encouraging, for example, equal pay and equal opportunity. So I took a number of cases that had big significance for women in Ireland on equal pay and equal opportunity. The last case that I argued during the presidential campaign, and it was in Luxembourg in the European Court. There had been a second reference in a case about discrimination against married women in unemployment benefit. So they were right at the bottom in unemployment and getting less in unemployment benefit than either married men or single men.
In
Ireland. Yes. And I had been engaged as their barrister, and we had already had a reference to Europe, which we won, but the High Court in Ireland said this will only be for the future. And I said, no, these women have been discriminated against. They deserve their money. And so the case was referred back, and the European Court ultimately agreed with me, but I was president at the time. But it cost the Irish Exchequer a lot of money to back pay for women who had been discriminated against. But that's the way it has to happen. If you have discrimination, hopefully someday you'll have to pay up.
And did other countries take an example from Ireland? And in a way, were you in the vanguard for women who are disadvantaged?
Well, certainly, I think for a number of countries which did not have full equal pay or equal opportunity for women, the European membership has helped a lot. It's one of the things to remember about Europe. Europe gets blamed a lot for bureaucracy, and there is a lot of bureaucracy, but it's also very helpful on a number of values issues.
Again, another rather corny question, but I think you can see why I have to ask it. If you had a chance to do it all again in your long career, that's to revisit some of the thorniest problems. Let's look at it from that point of view, because essentially you're a problem solver, and particularly in public life. Which were the ones that you would do differently, and why, if you had a chance to do it again?
Well, I think the most difficult issue that I faced when I served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was to be the Secretary General of the World Conference Against Racism. I was very committed to it, very committed to tackling racism. There had been 2 previous attempts that had failed. So it was my responsibility as Secretary General to see if we could succeed this time. It was going to be in South Africa, and in an earlier meeting, which actually happened in Iran, of all places, a regional meeting, language was inserted into the conference which was very anti-Semitic, but it was in square brackets, which means it wasn't agreed. But
that's the shorthand, is it?
The shorthand. The square brackets means, But there were a lot of, particularly the Jewish community in the United States, which didn't understand. They saw the language, and they got very angry about it, and they got angry before the conference in South Africa. They tried to persuade President Bush not to attend at all, not to have any representation. He sent in quite a low-key representation, and then eventually they pulled out with Israel before the end of the conference. We did actually get all that language out, and we got a successful conference, but it was 3 days before 9/11, and we never got proper recognition for it. And what I regret in retrospect is that I didn't spend more time spelling out clearly in the United States that there's a process for an international conference, and that this was language in square brackets is meaningless unless it's agreed later, and not to get too anxious about it, but to fight the fight. And if the United States had stayed in and Israel had stayed in, we'd have got better recognition for this conference, which ultimately was successful.
And just so I understand it, because I'm not a UN person, this Organisation Against Racism, was that part of the package that came with your job as the head of the Human Rights Commission? Is that how it works?
I didn't quite realise, because it was only shortly afterwards that I was given the additional task of being the Secretary General of this Conference Against Racism. They needed somebody in the UN to be it, and I was lucky or unlucky enough to be chosen.
So unlucky that 9/11 came when it did.
Very unlucky about the 9/11. It just prevented a proper assessment of the conference. But also, had the United States and Israel stayed in, and we got a good conference against racism, it would have made a difference for the whole world. And it's very relevant now for hate speech and the other, and anti-Semitism, which is again on the increase, and so on.
My guest today is Mary Robinson, former President of the Republic of Ireland, and 20 years ago, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights here in Geneva. Mrs. Robinson, most people, and politicians are probably no different, talk, but few act. In political life, what are the elements in political life, the essential components that go towards having the courage to do the right thing, that's to be guided by one's conscience, to act out fundamental principles rather than just to talk about them? I'm curious to know how you see that.
I think my approach is very simple. I just don't like bullies. And I found, as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I had to stand up to a lot of bullies in the international world. And I had no hesitation in standing up to them. And I think I was the strongest voice at the time, whether it was in different African countries, whether it was in China, in a balanced way, giving China credit for progress on economic and social rights, taking a lot of people out of poverty, etc., but also constantly reminding them that there were many, many worries and allegations of civil liberties abuses, civil rights. And a number of my colleagues in the UN would say to me, Mary, tone it down. I mean, and I never felt it necessary. And in a way, I felt the Chinese respected me more because they knew I wasn't being political. They knew that what I cared about was the human rights of the Chinese population. And I gave credit where credit was needed and due, but I also was very firm on the other side. And that was my whole motivation. You have to stand up to bullies, and you have to support those who are much braver than I was. I was based in Geneva. I always came back to Geneva from visits to difficult areas.
Safe sanctuary, so to speak.
Yeah, but what I met on the ground were these very courageous teachers, lawyers, trade unionists, human rights defenders who had to live in the country and who were as brave and standing up to bullies. And so, for me, it was absolutely essential to do it.
Yeah, many years ago I met Peter Eigen when he was head of Transparency International, and he talked about the people who did the field work for Transparency International and also Amnesty International. And I thought, my God, these people, they get no pay for it. Yeah. And yet they risk their lives, their reputations, their families for doing such invaluable work. I mean, really, one takes one's hat off to them. Yeah.
And that was what always energized me. My colleagues in Geneva would say to me, when I came back from Grozny or Colombia, where there was a lot of violence at the time or whatever, or parts of Africa, they'd say, you come back so energized. What is it? And it was meeting brave people on the ground who had the courage to stand up to intolerable situations.
And in a way to speak for them.
And yes, exactly.
So, okay, great character, but also having those people to do that, that's wonderful. Do you offer advice to young women and men if and when they ask you how to make the world a better place? And if you do offer advice, or if they ask you for it, what do you say to them?
I give one example quite a lot because it was an example that I suffered as a young person in being elected to the Irish Senate at the age of 25. I was determined to be somebody who would have a really strong policy programme, if you could put it that way. And the first thing that I wanted to do was to legalise family planning in Ireland, because it wasn't a very sensible policy anyway. Married women were not able to get the contraceptive pill unless their doctor prescribed that they had cycle regulation problems. And we used to joke that it must have been the Irish weather that so many women had cycle regulation problems. And it wasn't against the criminal law to use a condom, but it was against the criminal law to either buy or sell a condom. And these were, this was what made the law a bit ridiculous. So having come back from the Harvard Law School and having a certain amount of youthful, I suppose arrogance in a way, but confidence, I tabled a bill with the help of 2 male senators, and I was completely dismayed by the reaction because I became a hate figure. And I was used to being quite liked and admired.
Strong as that? There's a strong word to use.
A hate figure. Denounced in newspapers, denounced by bishops. The then Catholic Archbishop of Dublin had a letter read out in every parish in Dublin, saying that this measure, the bill that I had introduced, would be and would remain a curse upon the country. And I at the time was 26, going on 27. It was really tough. And I remember even walking down the main street in Dublin, Grafton Street, and being afraid that people would jump out and say, "You're a witch, you're horrible, go away," because that was the substance of the letters. And then I realised my husband actually burned a lot of those letters, which we both now regret because we're both archivists, and it would have been an insight. But I decided, if you really believe in something and you've thought it through, you've got to pay the price. So we stood firm. That bill was defeated. We introduced 2 more bills, moving on to the health family planning side. And then 9 years later, the government brought in a bill which was an Irish solution to an Irish problem, as it was called.
Well, this is another story of your courage to do that. You've brought the conversation around to your home country, the Republic of Ireland. And the question I have is, what in your country were the decisive undercurrents of change of which foreigners like me, for example, probably not aware, that have transformed an apparently conservative, traditional, deeply religious society into one which in a referendum just 2 years ago voted by over 60%, it's a big number, in favour of same-sex marriage and a change to its constitution? And are there lessons which other countries and other societies could learn from Ireland?
Well, certainly I am very proud of how my country has evolved, if I could put it that way. And there's no doubt that electing me president of the country in universal suffrage was a signal that Ireland was opening up, because I had a very liberal record. I'd taken cases including the issue of homosexuality to the court in Strasbourg, where we were successful and the law was changed in Ireland, and I actually signed the bill into law that made that change. But
so it was a criminal offence, as it was in the UK many years ago.
Yeah. But I think what influenced attitudes was also the revelations about child abuse, the revelations about abuse of women in laundries in Ireland, single mothers. The church lost a lot of moral authority. Now, we're still quite a religious people by European standards, but nonetheless, there was much more questioning. And then when there was a decision to have a referendum to change our constitution on same-sex marriage, what happened was it became a family issue. Families in Ireland realised they knew somebody, maybe a nephew, maybe a cousin, maybe somebody or a friend of their children, and some well-known people in Ireland came out and declared they were gay, and it became an issue for young people in particular. I remember being very proud to read about the number of young people who had left Ireland because of our financial crisis, but still had a vote in Ireland, and came back at their own expense to vote on that issue, because they wanted to signal this was a human rights issue, this was an issue. And I'm not sure where the example is for other countries. I think it has encouraged other countries like Germany, Australia, to put this back more on the agenda.
But tell me a bit more about, when you say it's a family issue, I mean, it was debated, obviously, in the family.
It was debated around kitchen tables, and it became an issue that people said, it isn't fair that people who love each other can't marry the way a man and woman can marry. And, somehow it became a personal issue rather than a statistic or a kind of policy issue. And
sorry if it sounds like a naive question, but with the Roman Catholic Church being so strong in Ireland, how does it work then? So the church isn't blessing these marriages.
No, it wasn't.
No. So this is a civil ceremony.
Yeah.
I just wanted to understand how that works. Yeah.
And the church wasn't in favour of the referendum, but didn't oppose it in the way it had opposed in the past, because it knew that the church had lost that kind of authority. But it made it clear this would not be church policy, and that's fair enough. That's clear. Why I say it became an issue for families and it was personalised is that we vote in constituencies, and every single constituency in Ireland except one passed the referendum. And the one that didn't, was very close. It was in the west of Ireland, in Roscommon. I come from Mayo, a neighbouring county. Mayo passed it.
It's beautiful there.
Yeah, and that in itself was extraordinary. So it wasn't Dublin, which is a fairly dominant city, against the rest of the country, which was rural and voting a different way. No,
right across the country.
It went right across the country. I think that was the difference. And that was why it's so acceptable. And our current Taoiseach is a very good example. He's young. He's Indian by background, half Indian, half Irish, and he's gay, and nobody makes an issue of it.
It's amazing. I think, that's in a relatively short period of time, the country's come so far.
And I really think that's progress for people coming into the country to feel. It's not that we don't have racism on the ground, but I am very proud of my country and what we've achieved.
My final question, Mrs. Robertson, is: it's clear to me that you're a practical and pragmatic woman. You must be to achieve what you've done in political and leadership over the many years that you've served. What do you think is the most important problem to be addressed today that the generation of your parents and grandparents, the same generation as my parents and grandparents, faced? What are the really key troubling issues for you?
I think there are two different issues. There's one that my parents and grandparents didn't face and weren't aware of, which I'm passionate about, and that is climate change. We are in danger of having an existential threat to future living. I have 6 grandchildren. I worry about their world, a world of 9+ billion people in 2050. They'll be in their 30s and 40s, more than half their life to live. What kind of world? That's a problem that wasn't faced. I'm very sad to see quite a lot of regression in women's rights because, in particular, of the example of the United States. The gag rule on family planning worldwide, the regressive policies, and I'm glad that there is a dynamic reaction of women marching in the streets and talking about women's rights in a way that wasn't the case a few years ago because they didn't need to. But that has an impact on developing countries where I spend a lot of my time, and it's harder to fight for the rights of women when the largest dominant democracy in the world is going in the wrong direction in the short term.
But before we finish, let's just talk a little bit more about the climate justice, because What I don't understand very well about this huge debate, and I've had different people on the programme before discussing this, is in practical terms, particularly a foundation like yours, how you go about beginning to make changes when you've got, as you said, on the one side the United States, big polluter, but also massive populations in China and massive populations in India, which also have an effect on this. What do you practically do in your foundation then to make a difference, to improve things, particularly for women?
Well, because we're a foundation on climate justice, we start with those most affected and least responsible. Because greenhouse gases come from driving cars, large manufacturing, air conditioning, and so on. And yet the biggest impacts are in the countries in Africa, for example, small island states that aren't doing that. And yet they are buffeted by the impacts. And one way of doing it is to get their stories out. And when you start looking at those stories, the stories of men and women are different. Women are more impacted because they're the ones that have to put food on the table. They're the ones that have to go further for the water or the firewood. They're the ones that so many communities felt that God was punishing them. You know, they didn't know how, they were bewildered. They're beginning to realize now, and least developed countries have realized that they must actually be more ambitious than anyone because they are most at risk of not being able to live, of having to move from their traditional land, either because of prolonged drought, prolonged flooding, or sea level rise that makes the island unlivable. It's already happening. People are forced to move because of climate change. And I was at a meeting in Addis about a fortnight ago of the ministers from the least developed countries in the world preparing for the next conference next month in Bonn under Fiji presidency. So a small island is presiding over this conference. And what they were saying was very interesting. It wasn't just complaining about the situation in which they find themselves. It's saying we must be more ambitious, move more quickly towards renewable energy. We want help to do it, but that's the way we want to go. That will give energy to our people, that will make us more productive, that will help us to be resilient and to fight this huge battle that we're not responsible for, but that's hitting us on a daily basis.
And not to finish the interview on a negative note, but just tell me a little bit more about this regression that you were talking about regarding women's rights, because I just wasn't really aware of that so much, and maybe people listening may not be so aware.
I think when in the United States you have policies, particularly on family planning in the United States itself, that are moving backwards. And then you have the gag rule, which prevents support for any kind of family planning. I'm not talking about abortion, I'm talking about family planning. And that's one of the problems of a population increase. In African countries, we're seeing certainly a 45%, pretty well a doubling of population by 2050 in countries.
It's staggering, isn't it?
It's staggering. We know how to deal with it. It's education of women and girls and access to family planning. And the unmet needs are huge. And they're worse now because of this gag rule. And when the policies of the United States on this issue are known, it has an impact in Latin America, in Africa, around the world. And it's very regressive. We should be doing the other. And cutting back on USAID, cutting back on State Department means cutting back on the very policies that were helping education of women and girls, and positive policies that the State Department and USAID were wholly committed to, but now it's going to be much more difficult.
But your foundation isn't directly involved in advocacy in that area. This is something which you personally just believe very strongly in.
And because one of our issues, one of the principles of climate justice is gender equality, of course I have to speak out on that issue. I'm also an elder. Nelson Mandela brought together a group of elders, and we are very strong on this. When the gag rule was introduced, Gru Brundtland and myself spoke out as elders very strongly. So I have various hats that I can use from time to time.
Mary Robinson, I could talk to you for much, much longer. Thanks so much for spending a few minutes with me today. And it's really good to see you again. Today my guest has been President Mary Robinson, formerly the President of the Republic of Ireland and the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
The Mackay interview is sponsored by the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, preparing leaders for new challenges in international security.